This lecture is part of the History 363 Modern Africa course online through Flagler College. I'm Dr. John Young, the instructor for this course. This second lecture is called Slave Trade to Legitimate Commerce. Make sure as you're viewing this lecture that you have already viewed the Historiography and Geography online lecture, which can be found under the modules here on the course Canvas site. And that will give you an overview of pre-modern African history if you haven't done that already. So some sense of the transatlantic slave trade and what that meant for Africa. So we're launching into a discussion which will take place over the next couple of weeks of this course about Africa in the 19th century. This was a period of transition away from an Africa dominated by the transatlantic slave trade to an African economy that was more diversified, though that still tried to hold on to those traditional structures. It's a period marked by African dynamism and African creativity, but also by what our textbook author Richard Reed calls creeping imperialism. And so we'll discuss those terms and what they mean for Africa. First, some broad themes. One of the dominant themes here in the 19th century is the impact of long-distance trade, both with the slave trade, which is coming to an end in the first part of the 19th century, and with the rise of what some have called legitimate commerce. I'll talk about that term in a moment here. Long-distance trade was tremendously important and was bound up with the political and social and cultural processes going on in Africa. The ruling elites of the various parts, especially of Atlantic Africa, the Atlantic coast of Africa, were all important in the African participation in long-distance trade. Ruling elites dominated the slave trade. They were the chief beneficiaries of it. In fact, if we can say that there was a benefit from the slave trade, though I'm not sure that that's a legitimate way to talk about it, it was primarily benefited ruling elites, the few rulers of kingdoms whose economy depended very heavily on the slave trade. Once Africa moved away from the slave trade to other forms of commerce, the ruling elites still tried to maintain a hold on the lion's share of the profit of long-distance trade. Now, this is all part of a very long historical process in Africa. We could go back into the pre-modern era and talk about ruling elites, especially in the West African kingdoms like Ghana and Mali and Songhai, and even in some of the smaller micro-states in the rainforest region of West and Central Africa. And note that ruling elites had a stranglehold in some cases, or at least the chief beneficiaries of long-distance trade, whether we're talking about trade, the trans-Saharan trade, or eventually the trade across the Atlantic with Europeans. However, there were, starting in the 19th century, more opportunities for people who were not the ruling elites to participate in this and to even benefit a great deal from it. And so, with the ruling elites being very important, with government and commerce being bound up with each other, we need to talk about mercantilism. That's the connection between political power and commercial processes. Africa really was a kind of mercantilist place in the 19th century, and that was just the extension of these trends from earlier eras. Slavery was something endemic to Africa. I talked about this a little bit in the last lecture. Slavery was part of the system in Africa that was geared toward power over people. Land in Africa was abundant, of course. Africa was until the 20th century an underpopulated continent, and so power in Africa did not mean power over land. It meant power over people. It meant keeping people in place and using either their labor or their reproductive capacities their loyalty, perhaps in some cases, to dominate, and to really the goal of political power in Africa was to have networks of people connected to or dependent on the one who was in political power. There are various means in pre-modern Africa to do this, coming up with systems to incentivize people to stay in place, kinship systems, traditions, even systems of rank and prestige and things like that. But slavery was a chief mechanism to do this. So once Africa began to participate in the transatlantic slave trade, it was sort of natural, that a natural extension of what was already going on there. However, the demographic impact, of course, was tremendous, tremendously negative for Africa. So now, with the shift away from the transatlantic slave trade, because slave systems were endemic to Africa, were common, were simply traditional, it was very difficult for Africans to, or even unthinkable for many Africans, to go away from slavery as an institution. And so we see this transition from a slave trade that sent people out of Africa to a slave trade that kept people in Africa but still enslaved. And we'll have more to say about that. The term legitimate commerce is problematic. It was a term used in the 19th century, mostly by Europeans, when they talked about Africa, about the need for Africa to move away from the slave trade, which was seen as morally reprehensible by most people in Europe by the middle of the 19th century. There were a few exceptions. The Portuguese, in particular, were pretty intransigent about this, continued to trade in slaves and insist on the legitimacy of slavery as an institution. But most people in Europe eventually came around to the idea that slavery was bad, and that the transatlantic slave trade needed to stop completely, and that Africa needed to be pushed, if necessary, and they saw it as necessary, pushed into what they called legitimate commerce, which means mostly the trade in agricultural products, because that was what Africans did. They farmed, they raised cattle, they did other things that can be identified as agricultural or pastoral. And so legitimate commerce would be to, have those kinds of goods at the basis of the African economy. The reason that I put legitimate in quotes here, and talk about it with some skepticism, is that legitimate commerce still involved a great deal of slavery. That many of these agricultural products that Africans began to deal in the 19th century were procured via slave labor. They were very labor-intensive crops, things like palm oil and rubber, and these were farmed, they were harvested, they were tended using slave labor. Slavery in parts of Africa, at least, may have actually increased as an institution. There were certainly more slaves in Africa, used in Africa after the end of the transatlantic slave trade than there were previously, because most of them were or a huge number of them at least, were being shipped out of the continents off to the Americas to work on the sugar and coffee and other plantations in the Americas. So, even with the move to legitimate commerce, warfare and the procuring of slaves through warfare continued to be part of life in 19th century Africa. The various states of Africa, particularly the Atlantic coast of Africa, were involved in trade. These were mercantilist states. They had expansionist tendencies, because whether we're talking about the procuring of slaves or the growing of these agricultural products as part of legitimate commerce, they needed more land, more access to people, and so they were interested in expanding. This is all part of this broader process of the growth of commerce and the kind of dynamism and creativity. This isn't, I think, by Western standards, morally good necessarily, but warfare became more pronounced, more endemic, more violent, certainly over the course of the 19th century because of this tendency to be linked with trade and to be linked with the state-building processes of Africa. Warfare also was occasionally put to use in some spectacular examples by Islamic jihadists trying to spread Islam, trying to create states that had Sharia law or Islamic law at their core. This is a long process that predates the 19th century and that has continued in Africa all the way to the present, as I'm sure if you watch the news at all or are aware of current events, organizations like Boko Haram are really just kind of the latest manifestations of some of these earlier processes, though perhaps more violent and more ideologically radical in their thinking. We also, I think, need to see the role of innovation here in warfare, though. Africans did not exist in stasis when it came to warfare. They looked for opportunities to improve their capabilities in war, and so we see a great deal of military innovation in the 19th century in Africa. The use of firearms, the increasing use of firearms being a chief example of this, but that wasn't the only military innovation. As we'll talk about in a later lecture, in southern Africa, for instance, the armies of Shaka Zulu and his successors used innovative strategies and tactics on the battlefield to conquer large territories and subject lots of people to their rule. The process that led to, sort of produced a chain reaction of events in southern Africa. Increasing European incursion into Africa also was an element of warfare. Europeans became involved in internal African wars, usually on the side of one group who in some way appealed to the Europeans, and we see through this the process of Europeans castigating certain African societies, demonizing them even, and this is all part of the creeping imperialism about which we'll have more to say. And so, we see, especially in Atlantic Africa in the 19th century, what we call West Africa, the creation of these polities, these states even, that have many of them have expansionist tendencies, and really, all of these budding states or budding policies competing with each other. Some of them procuring European aid in doing this, as the Europeans became more and more interfering in the affairs of Africa. Right. Now, we need to go back and talk about the legacy and the effects of the slave trade. So those are the broad themes. Let's talk in more detail about some of them. What were the motives of slave traders? This is, and we're talking about African slave traders here. European slave traders, I think it's pretty cut and dry. They were out to make a profit, and there was much profit to be made in transatlantic slavery. There's no doubt about it. The risks were high, certainly, but given the techniques they came up with to make sure that slaves would remain, in their holds, and there were slave revolts in ports, on the water, certainly in the Americas. Most spectacularly, the revolt led by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti in 1791. And so there were dangers to the European slave traders, but many of them obviously were willing to do this because there were huge profits to be made. Well, that's obvious. The motives of the slave traders in Africa may be less obvious. Slave traders, as I said before, slavery was an endemic institution, a traditional institution, a means of controlling people, keeping people in the same place and doing things that were that acted in the interest of those who owned slaves. And really, slavery is paradoxical, transatlantic slavery, I should say, is paradoxical in this manner, because political power in Africa was all about having people connected to the one seeking power, the one holding power. And so these people sought to obtain slaves because they wanted power over people, but then they turned around and sold the slaves, thus losing their power over the people. Well, what did they get in return? Mostly cheap European goods. Textiles in some cases, but the most popular goods that the slave traders demanded in return for slaves were alcohol, kind of cheap booze, cheap rum that Europeans were willing to supply, which is ironic because Africans produced their own indigenous alcoholic drinks, palm wine in particular. According to some, I don't drink personally, and I've certainly never partaken of this, but it's a pretty potent alcoholic drink by accounts that I have read. In any case, these European alcoholic drinks were, I think, probably lesser in quality, but it was about prestige. And so they demanded rum. The other one was firearms, and I think that the utility of firearms is pretty obvious, that they could be used then to fight wars and thus obtain more power over people. And so they were giving up people in order to obtain goods that would allow them to have more power over people. That's the paradox here. You can see that these slave states that developed in this era, whether we're talking about the Oyo Empire in West Africa or its kind of tributary states of Dahomey or Asante, or the Kingdom of the Congo in West Central Africa, down in the rainforest region, or other smaller slave trading states like Segu in West Africa. Their goal was still to have power over people. They did it by obtaining power over people, giving up those people, obtaining goods that would give them more power over people, and the whole process starts over again. Right? And so we see here the development of these mercantilist states, the states where commerce is intimately linked, commerce in human beings is intimately linked to the political, to political power. Now, with the move away from the slave trade, the desire for, or rather the mercantilist structures remained in place, and to a great extent slavery remained in place just as an endemic, or rather an endogenous institution rather than one that was targeted outwards. We've already discussed the demographic impact of slavery a little bit in the last lecture. We cannot ignore the obvious demographic impact of maybe 15 million people being taken out of a continent that was already underpopulated, so that was obviously tremendous. We've already differentiated between internal and external slavery here, external slavery came to an end, certainly in the 19th century, mostly at least, but internal slavery continued, and to some extent continues in parts of Africa all the way to the present. Now, why did the slave trade end? Well, there were shifts in the international economy. A lot of this had to do with the rise of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and the fluctuations of prices of goods on the international market. But a lot of this had to do with the growing force of abolitionism in Europe in the 18th century. The abolitionist camp was especially keen among evangelical Protestants who wrote and talked about about Africans as their brothers, but there was a motive behind this, I think, that we would see as not so pure, and that was that slavery was considered to be an institution that was morally evil, Even if it brought Africans into contact with European institutions, with Christianity, with civilization, it was still seen as morally reprehensible. But the desire to Christianize and civilize Africans was still there among the abolitionists. In fact, they considered the slave trade to be an obstacle to that, but they still wanted to intervene in Africa, and they saw the ending of the slave trade as the only way to do that morally and legitimately. And so, there's still very much this kind of interventionist mindset among the abolitionists. Slaves declined in value. By the beginning of the 19th century, due to the kind of equilibrium reached in parts of the Americas when it came to labor, slaves, having their own children, and the slavery becomes hereditary, there was less demand. There was still demand there, but it was lesser. As the British and the Danish initially abolished the slave trade, eventually that was taken up by the French and others much later. The Portuguese, not until the second half of the 19th century by the Portuguese. But there was an effort made by Europeans not only to abolish the slave trade in their own kind of colonial systems, but also to bring an end to slave trading in general in the Atlantic. The British sent their parts of their powerful navy to patrol the west coast of Africa to stop slave traders, and so this increased the cost of as slave traders in some cases took out insurance policies on their ships that could be seized by British patrol boats. There are various things that increase the cost of slaves. By the middle of the 19th century, transatlantic slave trading was really just cost prohibitive, and that's what ultimately brought an end to it, was the declining value of slaves and the increase of costs of the trade itself. Moreover, the needs of the Industrial Revolution were making themselves apparent in Europe. They didn't need slaves to work the machines in the factories of the Industrial Revolution. They had plenty of labor at home to do those things. Machines made labor, intensive labor, like was needed for working slave plantations in the New World. That was not necessary for the production of cloth and other finished products that became the standard of commerce in industrial Europe. What was needed were raw materials. Now, Africa had the ability to supply. They produced certain raw materials that were in high demand. Palm oil in particular. Now, there is a certain breed of, a certain species of palm tree that grows in Africa that produces these bunches of things called palm nuts. Look it up online if you want to see pictures of these. They look kind of like big bunches of grapes. But these palm nuts could be pressed to produce a very thick, very viscous oil that was used primarily to grease the machines. That's not a metaphor, that is literal. As lubricant for the machines of industrial Europe. And so palm oil became a product that was in very high demand in Europe. Well, Africa was the chief supplier of palm oil. Over time, rubber, which is an organic product. There are two main sources of rubber in Africa. There are wild rubber vines, and there's also tree rubber. There are rubber trees. These grew indigenously in Africa and very well in Africa, and so rubber over the course of the 19th century became a very important product, initially for machine parts, but eventually with the rise of the internal combustion engine and the development of automobiles, tires were in high demand, and we'll talk about this as we get to the book King Leopold's Ghost. But rubber is the other kind of main raw material that Africa supplied to industrial Europe. In addition to supplying raw materials, Africa presented to the Europeans a potential market, or many markets, for the finished products of the factories of Europe. The cloth in particular, though also firearms and other things that were produced on an industrial scale over the course of the 19th century. And so these they needed markets for these finished products. Africa presented an intriguing market, though certainly not the chief market for these products, but a market nevertheless. And so all of these things combine to bring about the end of the transatlantic slave trade. And this died hard. And slavery as an institution in the New World and in Africa didn't die out really for a very long time. But the trade itself was pretty much done by the 1850s. Even the Portuguese came around to the reality that there was no more demand for the transatlantic slave trade, and they were the last to do so, but they brought an end to their operations in that regard. Okay. Now, that brings us to the political situation in Atlantic Africa. Here we have a map of West Africa, just to point out a few of the political entities that we'll be discussing here. Through much of the 18th century, there had been a large empire here in West Africa, in what is now kind of western Nigeria and into the modern nations of Benin and Togo, called the Oyo Empire. It was bigger than this. This is a map from circa 1870. The kingdoms of Dahomey and Asante here were tributary states to Oyo. Oyo also exercised control of land, of territory over here into the Niger Delta region, the Igbo people, and also up here into the Sahel region, what would eventually become the Sokoto Caliphate under the rule of Islamic jihadists. Oyo was a tremendously important empire and one of the chief slave traders. Oyo, these are the Yoruba-speaking people of southwestern Nigeria. Those are the modern descendants of the people of the Oyo Empire. For the most part, during the transatlantic slave trade era, they were able to raid up here into the Sahel region and over here into the Igbo, what became the Igbo Confederation. They didn't have to trade in slaves among their own people. And so Oyo expanded via warfare. So did Dahomey and Asante, which were, as I said, tributary states to Oyo. Well, Oyo, with the end of with the pressure placed on slave traders to bring an end to the transatlantic slave trade, Oyo collapsed. Dahomey and Asante, on the other hand, were able to free themselves from their tributary status to Oyo and become independent. And even though they had a hard time giving up slave trading as well, they did make the transition more effectively into other forms of commerce, as we'll see. And so we're going to concern ourselves mostly with these kingdoms, okay, in the following discussion here. Now, I'll also mention the Kingdom of the Congo, which had existed since the 16th century. It was largely a slave trading kingdom dealing with the Portuguese down here in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo and further south into the modern nation of Angola. And so these were Oyo and Congo were very important slave trading kingdoms all through the 18th century, certainly. Okay, so the challenge of ending the slave trade is that this had become the basic form of commerce, and political power was tied to trading in slaves. Well, as I said, some made the transition away from that, some were not able to do this and collapsed as a result. Slave trade brought great benefit to the ruling classes. We've already talked about this. It's through trading in slaves, they could procure goods that could connect them to more people, would give them a bigger network of supporters. They had to do this by sacrificing some of the people they were connected to or they had power over, but that was the benefit. This did, however, benefit only the upper echelon of these African societies. The benefits, if we can even talk about them, of the slave trade were confined to just a handful of people. That's one of the most unjust conditions of the slave trade, is that whatever benefit Africa did accrue from this by trading slaves for other goods really only benefited those who were rulers. People like Gezo of Dahomey here, who's pictured on this slide. The shift to dealing in alternative products meant a total shift in the economic strategies of these societies. And the only way they could see to make that shift was to continue to use slave labor. And so they did. This is why legitimate commerce must, the term must be viewed with some skepticism. They did make that shift, but they did so by keeping the slaves at home and using them to work the palm, to press the palm nuts, to harvest the palm nuts, to obtain the rubber and other things that they were beginning to deal in, right? So I talked about palm oil. They did grow cotton to some extent. That was another product, though, the cotton of West Africa was certainly not produced in any kind of a volume like we see in other parts of the world, particularly Egypt and India and the southern United States in the 19th century. And so cotton was a product of lesser importance, certainly lesser than palm oil. We already talked about legitimate commerce. Now, as these African societies made the move away from slavery, transatlantic slavery at least, into legitimate commerce, into these agricultural products, European traders who were interested in these goods were confined mostly to the coast, whereas there had been a whole network set up of slave traders extending well into the interior of the continent. Slaves, of course, are self-transporting. They can walk, or they can be forced to walk from one place to another. You can't make palm oil walk, of course. And so this has to be transported. And we've talked about the difficulties of transport in Africa already. Due to African sleeping sickness, they didn't have big draft animals. They had to carry whatever they were trying to transport, usually on their heads. The tracks through the trails through the forest were narrow and fraught with danger, and so trying to pull a heavy load through a place where there is no roads and it's often overgrown was extremely difficult, nigh unto impossible, and so transporting these goods was tremendously difficult. Well, what that meant, and this was compounded by the fact that Europeans were not interested in going into the interior, at least in the first half of the 19th century, because malaria was so deadly for Europeans. Africans, by this point, certainly over the centuries, had developed a tolerance of malaria. It affected them less than it did Europeans. Up until the development of quinine, which was a kind of medication that combated malaria in the human system, the European death rate of those going into the interior of Africa was really high. I've seen statistics around 60% of all Europeans who tried to set up operations in the interior of Africa ended up dying of malaria before the development of quinine. Well, that's a huge proportion of these people, which meant that the Europeans remained on the coast. Well, the easiest way to access those markets, thus, was to be close to these trading ports controlled by Europeans. And so over the course of the first half of the 19th century, large numbers of people moved from the interior of Africa to the littoral, or to the coastline. And here we see the development, the growth of port cities, like most spectacularly the port of Lagos, which is now today probably the largest city in Africa. I think it surpassed Cairo a decade or so ago. but Lagos had been an important slave trading port. It became perhaps the most important trading port for these agricultural products in the first half of the 19th century. And so more and more people began to move to places where they could be close to ports like Lagos and thus trade with Europeans there. And the most powerful states that developed in Africa tended to have access, direct access to these port cities. The move to legitimate commerce did bring benefit to a wider segment of the African population. No longer could rulers maintain the lion's share of the power over the commerce because they, could not actually be out there farming the land, procuring the palm oil and the rubber and things like that. Peasant farmers, in some cases, were able to circumvent those political structures and deal directly with Europeans, or at least with middlemen who worked with the Europeans. And so more and more people were able to benefit from this. This wasn't just the handful of people who had benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. However, what this also meant was that more people came to own slaves. As peasant farmers made money, procured wealth through dealing in palm oil or these other products, they used that wealth to buy slaves, which meant they could produce more palm oil and gain more wealth and buy more slaves. And so that's the new circle. That's the new kind of vicious circle in Africa in the 19th century. No longer were slaves confined to the ownership of these very powerful individuals. Slave owning actually became more and more democratized, more common across Africa, which probably increased, almost certainly I should say, increased the number of slaves who were actually held captive and forced to work. Peasant farmers arguably probably worked their slaves harder than did those who owned large numbers of slaves, because if they have, if the slave owner is also a direct profiteer and has a small operation, they're more likely to work their slaves harder because their livelihood depends more directly upon that work, and they're more present in the lives of their slaves. So the actual lives of slaves probably decreased in quality as a result of this. Well, as all of these processes were underway, as slavery continued in Africa, continued to grow apace internally in Africa, as more and more wars were fought over control of people and control of territory that could be farmed for these agricultural products that were in demand in these markets, Europeans became more and more interventionist, partly out of moral concern for the growth of internal slavery, partly out of certainly out of European self-interest, that if they could access these agricultural products directly by actually owning and controlling the land, then their profit margins would go up. And so, all of this contributed to that intervention. Now, a good example of these processes at work is the ruler of Dahomey from the 18-teens to the 1850s. This guy was in power for a very long time, for decades. Gezo of Dahomey. You can see him pictured here on the slide. Gezo argued with Europeans all through the first half of the 19th century. There are a number of famous reports of Europeans meeting with Gezo, trying to pressure him to stop dealing in slaves. Gezo insisted that his entire kingdom would collapse if slavery was done away with, and that this would be bad for Africa. Well, what that meant really was that would be bad for Gezo, that his power would in some ways be compromised by this. And so he was used by Europeans as a kind of symbol of evil. symbol of the intransigent African who is enslaving his fellow Africans, and really became a kind of demonic caricature in Europe at the time. But Gezo was also important because even though he continued to trade in slaves, even with kind of clandestine Portuguese and other slave traders taking them, to plantations in Brazil, he actually dealt directly with Brazilian plantation owners in some cases. He also brought about incentives that allowed Dahomey to make the transition away from dealing in slaves primarily. Sorry for the background noise if you're hearing that. I'm filming this at home, and my family is obviously doing some things in other parts of the house here. Anyway, Gezo put into place structures, incentives that allowed Dahomey to move away from dealing primarily in slaves in the transatlantic slave trade to dealing in other agricultural products. And he set it up so that he would, of course, be the chief beneficiary of that. But Dahomey did witness this kind of democratization of slave owning, and more and more people profiting from this. Dahomey did survive the transition much more than Ozo or some of these other entities did. Well, what were the results of the economic shift then? Just to kind of recapitulate what we've said already. An increase in domestic slavery, but also exports of goods like palm oil, and an increasing reliance on European imports. In order to maintain their power and to grow politically and economically, rulers like Gezo of Dahomey had to continue to import European guns and European products that they could use to incentivize people to be connected with them, to give assent to their rule. Things like cloth and alcohol in particular became luxury goods dominated by people like Gezo of Dahomey, to give as gifts to his retainers to convince them to be loyal to him. And so really all of these kind of global economic processes collided and colluded with traditional internal African processes of the exercise of political power. And so there's some continuity and some change here coexisting. But also, just to reiterate a point I've already made, so we see the steps to European conquest. The Europeans became more and more interventionist over time, partly justified by their caricature of people like Gezo as evil slave traders who needed to be brought into line and kept in check from enslaving people. And so Europeans acted in more and more interventionist ways over the course of the 19th century. The Oyo and Congo empires collapsed, of course. Dahomey and Asante survived. We could have talked about Asante. The image you see here on the slide is actually of the traditional throne of the rulers of Asante. The king of Asante was known as the Asantehene. Asante is roughly coterminous with the modern nation of Togo, just as Dahomey is roughly coterminous with the modern nation of Benin. But this was the famous throne of the Asantehene, and just like Gezo of Dahomey, the Asantehene, various men who occupied that position, continued to deal in slaves partly, but also brought about this transition to legitimate commerce. And so what we have in the 19th century with figures like Gezo and the Asantehene are merchants who acted as hereditary kings, who established hereditary dynasties, some of which survived all the way through the 19th century. Now, in other parts of Africa, really in the kind of collapsed Oyo Empire, among the Yoruba people, we find a number of, a great deal of conflict and a number of forces at work with the failing empire. Powerful people who had held power in that empire sought to retain their hold over certain segments of the population and part of the land that had been included in the Oyo Empire. There was also pressure from the north with the growing Islamic Jihad, the development of the Sokoto Caliphate, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. That put pressure on what had been the Oyo Empire and the expansion of Dahomey and Asante. And so, ironically, the Oyo, who had been involved for a century or more in enslaving other people, enslaving the House of Fulani people to the north and the Igbo people to the east, and even to some extent the people of Dahomey and Asante, the Yoruba began to enslave each other, not to trade across the Atlantic, but now to use in the production of palm oil and cotton and coffee and the other things that were grown in West Africa. Well, with this endemic warfare in Yoruba land, with the expansion of Dahomey and the demonic characterization of Dahomey and Asante, the British began to intervene in this whole region. In 1861, they seized the port of Lagos, which they said was still being used to trade in slaves. This, of course, was in the interest of the British because this gave them direct control over the main port of the whole region and thus allowed them to control the flow of palm oil and other goods out of Africa. When the warfare continued and the internal slavery further inland remained in place, they finally just declared that the whole territory would be under British rule and be subject to British law. This was in 1892. They offered a declaration of peace for the whole region, and subsequently created the colony known as the Gold Coast Colony, the modern forerunner of the nations of Ghana, Nigeria, and other places. Part of this intervention was made possible by the development of quinine, this vaccine against malaria, and that coincided in time with a devaluation of palm oil as a product on the international market. With the full industrialization of Britain and other countries in Europe, with the machines now in place, and with the move to other forms of lubrication for these machines, and with a massive kind of global depression in the 1870s and 1880s. I mean, all of these economic forces combined to devalue palm oil. This led to, in some cases, a near collapse of the economies of these mercantilist states of West Africa and forced them to transition to other things. But this also allowed for increasing European intervention. In some cases, as in the various small political entities of the Gold Coast, the Fonte states as they were known, which were involved in this warfare in Yoruba land, they actually invited the British to intervene on their side against the expansion of Dahomey. And these, as I said, the demonic characterizations contributed to the British justification for intervening. Well, all of this led to this creeping imperialism, where Britain initially seizes Lagos, then they eventually impose their rule over the whole territory, and eventually create, kind of as a last step, create a permanent colony with British governors and everything. And we see similar things underway in other parts of Africa as well. Okay, so that ends this lecture. And I look forward to talking with you on the discussion boards about this. Please, if you have questions, write them on the discussion boards. If anything was not clear in this lecture, if you want to discuss them further, discuss the implications of them further, please make it known on the discussion boards. I look forward to talking with you about these issues.